Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Storm Hazard Mitigation Through Designing with Nature. My name is George Burgos and I'll be managing the technical aspects of today's webinar. While we wait for the others to log on, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. By now, you should have the GoToWebinar application running and should see the welcome presentation on your screen. If you're having technical difficulties using GoToWebinar, you can go to www.gotowebinar.com and click on the frequently asked questions in the blue navigation bar on the left side of the page. The presentation slides will be advanced by the presenter. Note a copy of the slides are also in your handout box. We encourage you to ask questions. Please use the GoToWebinar control panel and type your question in the area that says questions. Click send to submit it to the moderator. Please type your questions throughout the presentation. After today's webinar, there will be a short evaluation. Please take a moment to fill it out. Your feedback and suggestions are vital to helping us provide the highest quality speakers and information to meet your needs, as well as to get your suggestions for future webinars. Please take a moment to read the disclaimer. EPA doesn't officially endorse or recommend any trade names or commercial products that may be mentioned in this webinar. Before we get started, we'd like to ask a few poll questions to find out about who is attending our webinar and your background. What organization, if any, are you representing today? Education, academia, government agency, federal, state, local, private sector, business, non-governmental organization, or other? We're just going to give a few seconds. Okay, I'm just going to close and I'm going to share the results. So it looks like 1% is education, academia, 69% government agency, federal, state, or local, 22% private sector business, 4% non-governmental organization, and 3% other. Okay, we're just going to do one more. Has hazard mitigation planning or funding helped to advance green infrastructure projects in your community? Okay, I'm going to close and I'm going to share the results. 31% said no, 26% said seldom, rarely, and 43% said yes. Thank you. And today's webinar will be moderated by both Myra Schwartz from the Office of Assistance of Pollution Prevention here at the EPA New England. I will now turn this over to you, Myra.
Hi, well, welcome everyone. We're in store for a really great webinar today. I hope you were all not hindered by snowstorms around the country. Today we have three really great speakers. Really lucky to have them. We have Wayne Fiden from the city of Northampton. We have Rosalie Starvish from GZA, and Emily Slotnick from the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. And Wayne is the Director of Planning and Sustainability for the City of Northampton, Mass. He's also a lecturer of practice in planning and sustainability at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Mass. His focus includes sustainability, resilience, revitalization, open space, alternative transportation, and public health. He led Northampton to earn the nation's first 5-star community for municipal sustainability. His research publications include Conservation Limited Development, Building Sustainability and Resilience into Local Planning Agencies, and Local Agency Planning Management and Assessing Sustainability. He has served 33 multidisciplinary teams to other communities on revitalization and sustainability issues. We also have Rosalie Starvish, who serves as a project manager and water resources engineer for GZA, where she's been for 16 years. She's assisted numerous private and municipal clients with projects related to stormwater and watershed management and design, lake and pond restoration, flood control, flood impact and water quality analysis, dam maintenance, and planning, FEMA, hazard mitigation planning, and at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And then finally, we have Emily Slotnick, who's a senior planner and project manager for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission's Land Use and Environment section, focusing on community, open space, and resiliency planning. She has assisted communities around the Pioneer Valley and elsewhere in the country in completing resilience and hazard mitigation plans under federal and state funding programs. She is an AICP certified planner and a certified floodplain manager who, before joining Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, worked for 8 years in the private sector in disaster recovery, floodplain management, and resiliency planning. So welcome. And we're going to start with Wayne Fiden, who's going to give an overview of the Northampton project. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you very much. So Northampton's been focusing for a long time on dealing with stormwater, and we're an old city. We have a lot of obsolete infrastructure, a lot of potential flooding problems, and we've been looking at both traditional ways to deal with stormwater hazards, flooding hazards, and what we're calling design with nature, but basically green infrastructure programs. How do we take advantage of natural functioning to improve our systems? And I think for me, the most important point I'm going to make in the entire talk is this slide, which is that there's no silver bullet. There's no panacea and one thing that we can do to solve all of our problems. And so dealing with stormwater, we just need to do a lot of different steps to get there, all of which are important. So we have a stormwater utility, which is a way that we've raised money for both our stormwater system and our flood control system, and that's made a huge difference after 20 or 30 years of deferred maintenance. That's let us start catching up. We have stormwater regulations that affect all private sector projects and public sector projects above a certain size. We invest lots of our funds in both stormwater directly and in buying open space to preserve land. And then we do the planning process. So we have a hazard mitigation plan that meets the FEMA standards. We have a vulnerability plan that came from the Massachusetts funded municipal vulnerability program. And then we're going to talk about later today is we have a pilot program also funded from the state municipal vulnerability program to look at more of these sort of green infrastructure solutions. And our final sort of big project is we're going back. We've been doing a lot of efforts about climate change, but we've never felt like we have an overall framework. So we're in the process of creating that overall framework, and part of that is how does stormwater come in to affect everything that we do, and how do we address those things? So I'm just going to go through briefly and give some examples of what we're doing, and then turn it over to others who will be more technical. So, for us, we have a lot of flood problems, both localized flooding as well as large storms that flood huge areas. And we have this aging infrastructure. We just replaced a storm sewer pipe last year that was 160 years old. We have more of those out there. And so if our challenge is stormwater pipes that need work and we couldn't afford them even if it wasn't for climate change, how do we deal with a faster pace of upgrading given climate change? For us, I think we always focus on the co-benefits. We think it's really hard to sell a community on spending millions and millions of dollars on stormwater and doing things differently. But it's not difficult to say, here's all the things you've told us that you want our community to be. Let's move forward and making it a better city, and in doing so, deal with stormwater. So whether it's street trees or rain gardens or other things that serve both stormwater and make the community a better place, that's been where our biggest opportunity has been to make a big difference for the community. So, we started this process when we did our flood hazard mitigation plan. We did just sort of a very brief review of climate change. We did a traditional FEMA analysis, but we began to say, okay, we don't just want to look back in time. What's going to change and be different for us? And so we've tried to bring both sort of an understanding of what are the gaps we have already, and then what, trying to quantify what the gaps will be as a result of climate change. One of the first things that came out of that effort was feeling that we don't really have any faith in knowing where the 100-year floodplain is, both with climate change and also just we happen to have 40-year-old floodplain maps. So if we have 40-year-old maps and over the last 40 years, the floodplain has changed, and over the next 40 years, it's going to change more. How do we deal with that? So our first step was to downzone everything within the 500-year flood. And it's not that we think that's the right area for floodplain of climate change, but it was just a good surrogate. We had no other data, so we said, well, we've already mapped the 500-year floodplain. Let's start with that. And that was useful to us both in terms of protecting this land that we think will flood, but also, frankly, in terms of getting the community conversation going about what does climate change mean for Northampton and how are we going to address it. So we had surprisingly strong support when we increased the size of our floodplain to address the 500-year floodplain. With the Municipal Vulnerability Program funding from Massachusetts, we've tried to do more work, again, trying to quantify the change, looking at changes in precipitation, looking at changes in stream flow data, trying to project those out, just to give us a little more sense of where the risks are and to use that in prioritizing places that we want to work on. And so with that, we've been looking at, what are the things we can do for big capital investments, whether it's funded by state grants or funded by city money or funded from our stormwater utility. Some of these efforts are going to be green infrastructure and some are just traditional projects. But the picture you see here is a 160-year-old stormwater pipe that we replaced. We replaced just 600 feet of it for $2 million. And, it's a particularly large pipe. It was large enough for a person to walk through, and we needed to replace it to address some economic development and affordable housing downtown. But it was also sort of a wake-up call for us in terms of thinking about, okay, if we're spending $2 million for 600 feet, we obviously can't do this citywide. And so we need to think more about what's the right mix of what makes sense from capital improvements and what makes sense from some other solution. Obviously, part of our work besides stormwater is just looking at our flood control system. This picture is just of our stop logs being tested on a dry day to make sure we're ready for a storm. But thinking about the whole flood control system and stormwater as not two different systems, but one system that should be working in an integrated fashion. For our green infrastructure efforts, programs. So now whenever we repave a street and there's extra space alongside it, we put a little drainage swale in a rain garden or, street trees that let the road drainage go into it. The picture on the right is a brand new park or a park that we rehabbed recently. And we grab stormwater from the road and we run it through the park. And also to send a message that we're not afraid of water. Instead of sort of stormwater as being a problem that we want to send away, we want to figure out how can we sell gardens out there in the community. But they were all pilots in just open space preservation, trying to preserve our floodplain land, trying to preserve land which we couldn't, the cost of dealing with stormwater is so high, it's actually cheaper for us to buy and preserve the land than it is to make stormwater improvements. So again, trying to integrate different steps that we do into the stormwater story. And then the final part that we want to talk about is Municipal Vulnerability Program in Massachusetts to begin to take our rain gardens, our green infrastructure, and try to quantify the effort, try to sort of not just be random demonstration projects, but go deeper into the weeds and really see, can we catch water that's in downtown, that might go downtown, that might be hitting our stormwater pipes, and basically stop the water before it creates problems. And so we received this grant from the Municipal Vulnerability Program, and we hired GZA to look at a bunch of sites in town that we thought had opportunities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rosalie to talk about those projects. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Last slide, just again, our goal is how do we integrate these things all the way back into our comprehensive plan? We don't want stormwater to be in isolation. So how do we look at all these things, not just about stormwater, but as more comprehensive effort? So now, Rosalie, sorry about that.
Thanks, Wayne. GZA is right in the midst of working on this Northampton Designs with Nature project with the city. So I'm happy to be here today on this snowy day in New England to talk about our progress so far and what we've learned. The objectives of the project are to reduce flood risk and stormwater quantity in problem areas, as well as improve stormwater quality, while providing other co-benefits. In addition, the project aims to implement some highly constructible projects that have short-term benefits so that we can demonstrate results to spur interest in additional positive impacts. The scope of work for the project includes the preparation of conceptual designs for sites that have been selected from throughout the city, based on review by field inspections and preliminary site assessments. And from there, the project team will select from those conceptual design projects which projects would continue to 25% and through to 100% design, with permitting and preparation of bid documents for construction-ready plans. The scope also includes a public engagement process, which is being led by our sub-consultant, Linnaean Solutions. And they've been involved in other city initiatives, so they're providing continuity with the city's broader climate resilience and regeneration plan. And then we also have Niche Engineering on board. They're providing support to the project throughout the design process. The city selected the initial 10 potential project locations before GZA got involved. They put those project locations into the RFP process. They had a roundtable brainstorming session to come up with those initial sites. The focus was on properties that are under city control and areas that have historical flooding issues. Then also there were some areas where some flooding problems have been studied in detail in the past, and there have been some structural solutions that were developed that would likely greatly minimize the problem or eliminate the flooding problem, but which would be quite costly to construct and implement. So the objective of the first phase of the project was to select projects that would advance to the conceptual design, and then considering which of these projects would provide the most benefit for flood resiliency. So we began by inspecting each site in the field to review local conditions and understand the issues within the broader watershed context. Throughout this process, we consulted with the city DPW for their local knowledge and perspective. And then as we reviewed the sites, we began to formulate potential design with nature projects that would address the issues of concern at each site. So what began as 10 sites yielded nearly double the number of potential projects. And this was partly because new sites presented themselves as we looked at the overall watershed context for those first 10 initial sites. And then, as we grew to understand the issues of concern, some of these projects expanded onto private properties as well as city-owned properties. So, we couldn't support with our project budget and timelines preparing conceptual designs for 20 sites. We had to narrow those down with a preliminary site assessment. In some ways, this was a process of elimination. It was apparent early on for some sites that a designs with nature project would not offer a significant benefit, or it might only benefit a small localized area, such as solving a small neighborhood drainage issue, but without providing a broader benefit to the watershed. And in some cases, the means to implement the project might have greater adverse impacts. For some of these projects, there were private property conflicts that were deemed too complex to address in the time frame of this project, which is actually limited to a 1-year period of performance by the grant funding. And then we prioritized sites where there were historical flooding issues that were frequently impacting the public. And then another consideration was that so in some of these projects, the main driver of the problem actually seemed to be maintenance concerns. Maintenance of existing drainage infrastructure was a concern at many of these sites, but in some cases it seemed to be the main issue. So we've narrowed the list down to about 11 projects for the development of conceptual designs, and these pretty much fell into two categories. First were sites that lended themselves well to mitigation of impervious cover using green infrastructure. And these were more of the traditional look at green infrastructure using bioretention and potentially subsurface storage to mitigate peak flow rates in the downstream watershed. And this type of project generally has obvious co-benefits and includes helping the city achieve compliance with their MS4 permit. And then the other type of project were sites that require mitigation of flooding to the urban environment at the source, such as a more traditional overtopping of a stream channel. The value in the stormwater green infrastructure is that it can provide smaller scale site improvements that, when are implemented in multiple locations throughout a watershed, can help to reduce the stormwater peak flows and volumes to mitigate downstream flooding. But sometimes other solutions are necessary at the location of the flooding source. Oops. We're currently in the process of finalizing our selected conceptual designs and evaluating them based on a more detailed site assessment using these primary elements that are listed here. So with stormwater and flood management, we're looking at how well does the project mitigate stormwater quantity, reduce flooding potential, and enhance resiliency to flooding. Human impacts are things such as, does the project provide education to the public, recreational benefits, or connectivity with walking paths throughout the city. We're also looking at utility conflicts, impacts to wetlands or rare species habitat, and then design challenges such as site accessibility or property ownership limitations. We're also doing evaluation of costs and co-benefits. And here is a list of the types of co-benefits we're looking at. These are related to wildlife habitat, water quality, wetlands, tree canopy, and other city planning goals. The community engagement process that I had mentioned previously provided valuable input regarding the public's perspective on opportunities and co-benefits with these potential projects. So overall, by this stage in the project, we're at the level of preparing our conceptual designs, and we've gained an understanding of some considerations for designing with nature for improving flood resiliency and water quality. So I'll go through those quickly right here, and then I'll close out with a brief case study that demonstrates these considerations. First, looking for nature-based solutions to a problem that's already been studied can reveal a more cost-effective approach than the traditional structural engineered approach. However, that doesn't mean that nature-based solutions are inexpensive necessarily. A nature-based solution alone may not be able to completely address the flooding problem, especially in an urbanized area. A combination of nature-based improvements with traditional hard infrastructure might be necessary, or if your project wants to maintain the nature-based solution, the achievable level of protection might be less. And there can be some permitting challenges when you're implementing a nature-based solution, you might often be manipulating the natural environment, especially in the vicinity of stream channels and wetlands. So you might be exceeding impact thresholds or converting one type of a wetland to another type. And so there has to be some creative coordination with the permit agencies to balance the objectives of the project and within the constraints of environmental regulations. So the case study I'll talk about today is the Elm Street Brook project, which passes through the property of Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School. And then it veers to the east and runs parallel to Elm Street before it enters a closed drainage system. As the brook approaches Elm Street, it narrows, straightens, and it flows very close to the edge of the road, and flooding over the road is a frequent problem at this location. A prior consultant for the city had looked at a traditional solution of building an underground flood diversion culvert, and they had projected a cost of about $6.5 million to construct that. And the solution would likely be successful, but the city was interested in another look at a potentially less costly option. So in this watershed, the high school property, which I have marked here as number 1, presented a great opportunity for some green infrastructure to mitigate stormwater runoff. There's a large expanse of impervious cover at the high school, and the stormwater system there was designed prior to any requirements for peak flow control or water quality treatment. And in addition here, we also looked at the potential for adding floodplain storage down along the brook known as number 2 here. There's undeveloped upland area that provides opportunity to do this. However, the volume of storage that would be required to meet a certain level of flood protection might be difficult to actually accommodate with the given space there. So flood barrier between the brook and the street might be necessary, or would likely still be required. Some of the challenges with this are that the areas, even though they are upland areas, and we would try to limit of creating floodplain to those areas, it's still a regulated resource under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act as riverfront area, and alterations to this area, as well as any alterations to the stream and link agencies. So at this stage of conceptual design, we've estimated the cost of this project to the portion down by Elm Street to construct floodplain storage and flood barrier is at about $1.6 million. Now, overall, this is less than the original concept of building a flood bypass culvert, but it is still a substantial cost. And the big contributions to this cost include control of water at the site, the earthwork and removal of the excess material from the site, and also construction of the flood wall that would be required. And also, restoration of the riverfront area with replanting of trees would also be necessary, which would add to the cost. So I hope that this case study has provided some insight into the engineering considerations that go along into designing with nature, and I'll turn it over to Emily, who will talk about the regional approach.
Thank you, Rosalie. All right, so that our agency has pursued. So tackling climate change and stormwater management from a regional perspective offers obviously some unique challenges that are adaptive strategy on their own. Northampton is obviously an exception, and we have a few other exceptions in the region, but we do have a lot of smaller communities. So at the same time, we're trying to bring communities together to partner on initiatives and thereby increasing the impact that we could have. In Hampden and Hampshire counties. And our agency periodically produces a series of core regional plans across a variety of disciplines, sort of typical regional planning agency type of plans. We also provide various services to our member municipalities in local planning services, and one of those is assisting with the development of local hazard mitigation plans. So FEMA defines hazard mitigation as any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from hazards and their effects. The Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 requires that any government agency or state or tribal or local governments develop and then adopt hazard mitigation plans. And we do this as a condition for receiving certain types of federal grant assistance, specifically disaster assistance, funding for mitigation projects, et cetera. All of these plans, whether it's a state level or the local level, have to be updated on a 5-year cycle. So in a lot of ways, the term natural hazards is synonymous with a lot of the impacts of climate change. So there's this natural nexus between the two, and the impacts from climate change that our communities in the Pioneer Valley are experiencing right now are really similar to those that communities around the Northeast of the United States are facing. We're looking at more extreme precipitation events and associated flooding, more heat waves and extreme heat events, severe weather events in general, and that can be severe winds or snowstorms, ice storms, new threats to various ecosystems, and then increased threats of agricultural pests. Some of those climate impacts are going to hurt us here in the Pioneer Valley region more than in other areas, just simply based on our geographical location and sort of combined that with our development history. Being in New England here, a lot of our towns are settled in the sort of 1700s, 1800s. A lot of our critical infrastructure is more than 100 years old. And some of the challenges we see are in our downtowns are that we deal with low-lying areas that are also home to disproportionately large numbers of economically disadvantaged families, our vulnerable populations. At the same time, this is the same place that our concentration of businesses and cultural landmarks are, and all of them are uniquely vulnerable to flooding. So our communities are looking to address the new flood challenges presented by climate change. At the same time, we're dealing with the realities of and the costs really of aging infrastructure. It's not only undersized for the new normal of our climate change impacts, but it's already in need of replacement from age alone. And Wayne gave a pretty good description of that, I think, early on in the presentation. So stormwater and land use contribute to water body impairments in our regions. It's another one of our challenges. Two of our major water bodies, the Connecticut River being the biggest, and then the Chicopee, also a major water body in our region, can't currently support primary recreation activities due to E. coli impairments from wet weather discharges. So the cities of Holyoke, Chicopee, and Springfield right now are all under administrative order from EPA to remediate CSOs. At the same time, we have communities in our region that are dealing with a rising water table, and that increases the risk of drinking water contamination from pollutant loading through stormwater. So, you know, at the most basic level, we can incorporate climate change into FEMA hazard mitigation plans just by using the best available data and science to look at the risks that these impacts of climate change present, and recognizing that these are not, they're not our grandparents' natural hazards that we're dealing with anymore, and sort of planning accordingly. In Massachusetts, the state in the last couple of years commissioned the Northeast Climate Science Adaptation Center at UMass Amherst to complete a statewide comprehensive report on climate change and they utilized a downscaled model that gave us temperature and precipitation projections down to the watershed level and also the county level. And so we've never had climate projections at this fine of a grain of detail in the past. And they're looking out till the end of the century. They're sometimes broken down by season in most cases, so you can look at winter projections versus summer projections. And what we get from that is we can see, for instance, a town in the Connecticut River Basin could see a gradual increase in annual average temperature and annual precipitation over the course of the century, at the same time as an increase in days with precipitation over 1 inch. And it would also tell us potentially that rainfall is expected to increase in the spring and winter months in particular. So understanding that both winter precipitation and winter temperatures could increase in future decades, we then deduce we can see more of this precipitation falling as rain instead of snow. And all of this has implications for when you're doing hazard mitigation planning and what we're looking for. So how do we take all of that and work it into the hazard mitigation planning process? A lot of that process is somewhat formulaic, but there's a lot of flexibility for us to incorporate this new data. Just sort of basically here, the major steps in the HMP process are reviewing the capabilities locally, assessing the risks, coming up with that mitigation strategy, and then adopting the plan and keeping it current over time. You know, I'm a trained planner. I like to reference the quote from Dwight Eisenhower that plans are worthless, but planning is essential. And so I think, like with so many other planning activities, the hazard mitigation planning process itself is the most important thing, far more so than maybe the plan that results. And so in my experience, one of the most important parts of that process is to build a diverse planning team. At the very beginning of a hazard mitigation plan, whether it's a new plan or an update, your community is going to be pulling together the local planning team or the hazard mitigation planning committee. And as basic as it sounds, I think that encouraging communities to have a really diverse planning team can be the difference in making a plan that is robust enough to support climate resilience versus a plan that is more focused on sort of simply disaster management or just sort of the status quo of whatever the previous plan did. So a couple of ideas for representatives that could be included on this slide. Also consider your boards and commission members, so your planning board, conservation commission, energy commission, zoning board, et cetera, tree committee, and then also your regional partners, certainly. So if you have a regional planning agency or if it's a county planning agency, and also your municipal neighbors in some cases are important members of that planning team. So the next big step in the hazard mitigation plan is to conduct your risk assessment, and that starts with the local planning team identifying your natural hazards of concern. So how do we bring climate change into this? Instead of just continuing with the natural hazards that have historically been of concern in your community, we can now look at the climate projections and make reasonable assumptions about which hazards are likely to have a greater impact going forward. So we're really reframing the question to which climate-influenced natural hazards are going to be the top priorities for the city or town to consider in assessing vulnerability and planning for resiliency. Oops. Am I going backwards? Yeah. There we go. Okay, so the right column here takes what we learned from the hazard mitigation plan and a study of past hazard events, along with stakeholder input and those new climate change projections I mentioned. And it now frames these natural hazards in a way that's bringing climate impacts into the heart of that risk assessment. So an example of this, a lot of our communities in the region are fortunate to have an abundant local drinking water supply. The vast majority of residents in our rural communities rely on private wells for water. And in 2016, we had one of the worst droughts in recent history. And some of our cities and towns were enforcing water restrictions. A lot of private wells ran dry, especially the older shallow wells. The new climate data that we have suggests that we're going to see an increasing amount of consecutive dry days in the summer and fall in much of our planning area. And what showing on this slide here is that projection for the Westfields River Basin. More of these types of dry periods in the summer can combine with higher temperatures to increase the frequency of episodic droughts, like that one in 2016. So even though we're not historically a drought-prone region, every hazard mitigation plan that our agency worked on with one of our communities since that summer of 2016 has included drought as a hazard of concern. And we've referenced these climate projections and sort of taken those further to talk about anticipated decreases in snowpack and impacts that might have, or expected increase in heat waves and higher average spring and summer temperatures. And all of these are indicative of future drought concern. But getting back to the flooding piece, so we're also incorporating these findings into the flood section of the hazard mitigation plan, because more frequent droughts could also exacerbate the impacts of flooding by damaging vegetation that could otherwise help mitigate those flood impacts. We also know that drought can weaken tree root systems, so those would be more susceptible to toppling during high wind events. All of these cascading types of impacts are going to be considered during the risk assessment. Similarly, we have seen localized flooding in the last decade or so in places where water has never been seen before. So we know, as Wayne said earlier, we can't rely on the 40-year-old FEMA flood maps to really accurately give us an evaluation of risks associated with the flooding that we're seeing today and that we'll see in the future. So we look to other approaches, and whether that means electing to regulate to higher standards, with requiring additional freeboard, or limiting development of the 500-year floodplain as they did in Northampton, or incorporating new climate projections into the risk analysis. All of these approaches should be written into that hazard mitigation strategy if they're not already incorporated into a municipality's regulatory structure. So the results of these front-end steps in the hazard mitigation process is what we call the mitigation strategy, where communities make a list of the projects that they're going to pursue in the next 5-year planning cycle, and in some cases beyond, to mitigate the impacts of natural hazards. So we're looking at available funding sources here, cost effectiveness, longevity, excuse me. Also how a proposed project is going to capitalize on natural systems to support reducing risk. And having referenced all of the climate change data throughout the risk assessment part of the report, the Hazard Mitigation Committee at this point can come up with actions that are really meeting the most pressing needs, not just for mitigation, but also for resiliency. And to do so with a little bit more clarity on how to prioritize those actions for funding. And so an example of that would be installing rain gardens that will reduce localized flood risk, also recharge the aquifer and buy down the risk for drought potentially in the future. I just want to point out that the green infrastructure projects shown here are taken some of them taken locally, and while they may not have been funded through hazard mitigation planning program grants, the fact that they could have been identified in the hazard mitigation planning process would give them credit in other grant programs and could increase opportunities for implementation through grants, but also through city capital budgeting. So throughout the whole planning process, our agency helps communities take a look at their regulatory structure to make sure that it's going to function as intended in the face of these new climate changes and impacts. So the local committees are going to look at whether or not, they have a stormwater code, or, excuse me, how they regulate development in the floodplain or other critical environments or sensitive habitats. So by the end of the process, a lot of these communities resolve to propose either a full detailed review of their existing regulatory structure and potentially update some of those codes or create new ones. And in this way, as we work with communities to update local hazard mitigation plans across the region, we're seeing incremental progress on the issues actually at a regional scale. So I want to end just by talking quickly about a few other ways in which we as a planning agency are working towards climate resilience. The 2016 MS4 stormwater permit has a number of new requirements that will lead to greater costs for compliance for our communities. So we got an efficiency and regionalization grant from the state to work with communities on a full regulatory review of their existing stormwater codes, and then to suggest revisions for compliance with the new permit. And as part of that, we're looking actually across their codes, so not just in their stormwater codes, but looking at their subdivision rules and regulations, their zoning, site plan review, wetlands regulations, et cetera, to make sure that there's no conflict between those and any potential updates that they make to the stormwater code for compliance. So we're working with 12 communities right now on that. And one of my colleagues recently completed another project with a number of partners to create guidance for developing an off-site stormwater compliance program. And this is specifically for redevelopment projects in Massachusetts. And that was done with funding through a Mass DEP MS4 assistant grant. The manual, it's going to be written to assist MS4 communities in doing the off-site mitigation option for developers who otherwise can't meet the updated stormwater retention standards on redevelopment sites. And it's going to lay out steps that a community could take or sort of consider taking to build that into their stormwater code, and also give a series of policy choices to help steer a community in that decision-making process. We do lead a number of regional advisory committees, and for many years have facilitated the Regional Intermunicipal Stormwater Committee of 19 municipalities and UMass Amherst. We also provide technical support to local planning boards, where we're actually beginning to have more conversations about stormwater management for large solar developments, and advising communities to really think about large-scale solar arrays as a form of impervious surface, and then reviewing applicable codes to account for that impact. And finally, I wanted to mention the Springfield Rain Garden Grants Project, which sort of as an example of where we partnered with a community to build resiliency locally while also advancing our understanding of the issues and best practices. So this is with the Mass DEP Supplemental Environmental Project Funding grant. One of the goals of this project is really to understand the cost benefit of green infrastructure installments. So looking at the investments that we put into the projects versus the actual value that we derive from it in stormwater mitigation. And this one is still ongoing, but we've built the 5 rain gardens in Springfield, and we'll be moving into the evaluation phase soon. And that concludes my part of the presentation.
So in closing, we just wanted to go over sort of what we think are the 6 most important points to think about as takeaways. The first one for us is, as we deal with green infrastructure, there are some challenges, and one from a city planning perspective is green infrastructure is often more land extensive. And we're always concerned about, well, if the solution is more land extensive solutions, is that just going to force development away from our center cities, more into greenfield, pristine areas, and actually have a greater environmental impact? So we're always balancing what's the right solution. Is it a green infrastructure solution, or is it a traditional pipe system that lets us develop at greater densities? And there's no overall answer, really. It's site specific. We always look at that from that perspective. The second point is that co-benefits that I opened with is we're not going to get resources, we're not going to sell things to our community unless we can think about all the ways the stormwater improvements we're making also affect other public benefits as well.
Yeah, the third point here, green infrastructure is not without its challenges. It's not necessarily a minimal cost approach, although you have to look at the specific solution at hand. And also by the nature of looking at solutions to flooding problems, you're often working near wetland resource areas, and that can pose challenges for implementing and permitting the project. The fourth point here, green infrastructure is one tool in the toolbox from an engineering perspective. In a developed environment, you might need to use green infrastructure in combination with more traditional engineering approaches to improve flood resiliency.
So the fifth point here, think big and think green on mitigation actions. I wanted to sort of reiterate that hazard mitigation plans can make a big difference. Going back to something that Wayne pointed out earlier, we worked with Northampton in 2008 on their hazard mitigation plan, which called for that 500-year floodplain to use as a proxy for areas that might be impacted by flooding from climate change. And that led to, the ban on development in a very vulnerable part of town. And then finally, the share, spread, and leverage resources to align local actions with regional goals. A lot of the municipalities in our region are working with very limited access to resources. So from a regional perspective, we look at success as sort of, in a lot of ways, based on how well we can educate our communities on best practices, provide access to resources like grants and trainings and model regulations and so on to help them move the needle forward. And then incrementally, municipality by municipality, we start seeing change at a regional level.
Great. Thank you all. I'll turn it back to EPA.
That was a great presentation. Thank you, Wayne, Rosalie, and Emily. So we have a few questions, but before we do that, we're going to hand it back to George Burgos for a poll question.
Okay, just bear with me 1 second. I am getting some questions that folks are having some spotty connection. On our end, everything is pretty fine, so I'm just guessing that it most likely is due to the weather. Here in Boston, we're just getting the snow right now, so please, this is going to be recorded, and hopefully we'll get it translated and posted online. And now for our poll question. What is the biggest barrier to integrating green infrastructure into hazard mitigation planning? Lack of resources and funding to implement green infrastructure, lack of information on the specific cost of green infrastructure, unaware of the effectiveness of green infrastructure to address flooding, lack of communication during the planning process, or all of the above? Okay, give you a few minutes. Okay, I'm just going to close and I'm going to share the results. 21% said lack of resources and funding to implement green infrastructure. 12% lack of information on the specific cost of green infrastructure. 10% unaware of the effectiveness of green infrastructure to address flooding. 5% lack of communication during the planning process, and 52% all of the above. And now for questions. Just before we start questions, if you want to download today's presentation, in your panel, please just locate the handout panel. Just click on that and you will see the PDF version of this presentation in Myra. Questions?
Okay. Before we launch into any other questions, I want to see what our panel thinks about what they think are the biggest barriers to integrating.
We got religion. Is there resources to just bung it, and also the land availability. If we had the resources, we'd do more.
I would say that with bringing green infrastructure into hazard mitigation planning, I think one big challenge is when you're looking at trying to mitigate hazards, particularly flooding in an urban environment or a developed environment, having the space to implement the green infrastructure can be a challenge when your flooding is occurring near the built environment.
Yeah, and just from a regional perspective, I think I would say that resources are a big one. And then also communicating with our municipal partners the benefits and the effectiveness of green infrastructure, sort of the cost effectiveness as well. So it comes back around, it's resources and communication and education.
I just add one other resource, which is you can't do green infrastructure without thinking about the maintenance, so that 160-year-old pipe we replaced probably had zero maintenance for 160 years. When we plant a rain garden, we need to immediately budget for maintaining that. And so sometimes, particularly in recessions and hard times, there's a risk of are we maintaining this stuff correctly?
Right, that's probably key, and can't emphasize that anymore. And I think it's important to factor that in the beginning so people know the realistic cost of everything. So, do we have a question? Does Northampton promote or have experience with the use of permeable pavement as a green infrastructure BMP?
So in Northampton, we've used permeable pavement just a little bit. We experimented with sort of the plastic version at one of our recreation areas, and it was sort of a failure because it was plastic. It didn't withstand the traffic. We've had a couple of private projects who did some parking with permeable pavement. We follow carefully what's happening at University of New Hampshire, and there's a park and ride lot in Whately right near us. So we're intrigued. We are a little worried. Again, it's the maintenance issues. Can you really keep it clean, so it doesn't clog quickly? As I say, we have a couple of pilots going on. We haven't done anything large scale.
I think one of the conceptual designs we're looking at is including an option for permeable pavement that might be implemented if the city chose, at a time when they're repaving that parking lot or need to, update the parking lot at a school.
It's also, it's certainly site specific. So downtown Northampton was built on top of a lacustrine and clay soils. And so permeable pavement in our downtown just isn't that useful. In some of our other areas, it's built on sand outwash plains, and their permeable pavement would make a lot more sense.
Interesting. Okay. There was a question about how would you adapt this approach to a rural area versus an urban area?
Yeah, well, so I'll speak to the hazard mitigation approach. I think that depending on where you are, if this is a Massachusetts community, I think that there are resources for your rural communities, and your regional planning agencies are one of them. I think you also need to look outside your borders, look for what your neighbors are doing, what plans have been created outside. And then the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program in our state right now is a huge resource for hazard mitigation planning, for resiliency planning. It's really giving both rural and urban communities, but for the purpose of this question, would give a rural community an opportunity to have really easy access to funding, to the new climate data, and to a planning process that can really sort of jumpstart a resiliency action plan and then sort of starting to implement projects. So I think that probably in any state, it's a matter of being keyed into what funding resources are out there right now, what programs are ongoing. And I think that if you don't have the capacity in your rural community to keep track of all that because you're volunteer-based or you just are understaffed, then reaching out to your regional or county agencies, or even if you're located near a larger city that has greater capacity, just having professional connections where you can ask what they're doing and maybe learn from that.
In rural areas, obviously, there's a challenge of resources, but because some of the solutions are land extensive, it's often easier to take advantage of. So we had one area we were involved with, for example, where we bought some land next to a neighborhood that had some flooding problems, and we received a state grant program. It doesn't exist anymore for restoring wetlands. And we took out an acre of a wetlands that had been filled. We restored the wetlands. And so even though it was done primarily for wildlife and for natural systems benefits, it created a huge amount of storage that stopped the neighborhood flooding. And that you obviously can't do in a downtown, but you can do in a lot of rural areas.
Excellent. Let's see. For the Elm Street project, did you look into retrofitting the impervious paving at the school?
Yeah, so the conceptual design for the school, there's a large expanse of green space in the front yard, which is a perfect opportunity to collect stormwater from the paved parking lots and, you know, bring it into some bioretention areas in the front yard of the school. In that particular case, I mean, obviously, permeable pavement would be an option. But that, you know, I think we'd have to look at the soil conditions there to see if it would be ideal there.
Okay, excellent. Let's see, we have a question about stormwater utilities. And we want to know, how did Northampton manage to implement a stormwater utility in its area? Apparently the person writing in did not have a favorable experience with it. So any lessons learned or any tips on how to do it? Wayne?
Well, it was a long conversation. For us, it was probably, I'm not sure, 3 or 4 years of community conversation trying to get there. We took a somewhat different approach. To some places, Portland, Maine, for example, set up a stormwater utility, but they basically they were paying for stormwater from their sanitary sewage, so they reduced the sanitary sewage rates and added the stormwater utility, so it was revenue neutral. For us, we just felt like we needed more funding to do the deferred maintenance, and so we were very clear about that. We did a few things to sort of build community consensus. So the city had already been doing some work for stormwater, not as much as we needed to, but some work. And we did a sort of hold harmless provision, so the city's contributions didn't drop. So it wasn't just a matter of bringing more money to the city for new for non-stormwater projects. We had lots of debates about the formula, and now half a dozen years later, we still have those debates. I'm a big believer in ecological services, environmental services, where we reward farmers for keeping their land open to allow it to flood. We didn't put that into our system, so I hope we do as we retrofit. But it was just lots of conversations. Every time someone said stormwater tax or rainwater tax, we said, no, this is a utility. You're paying the services that you're using. And it was just a slow consensus building process for city council and the community.
Excellent. It seems to speak to the overall issue of how did you get buy-in, particularly from DPWs, buying into this planning approach.
Well, that's why.
Yeah.
Certainly for this panel, that's the reason that our engineer is here, because we want to say, it's really easy to say, we're going to do these green solutions and it solves everything, but the devil's really in the details. And there's some places where green infrastructure saves money or is a better solution, and some places where it's absolutely not the right solution. And I think our DPW, at least our buy-in from DPW, and they were a leader in this, but one of the reasons they were on board is they realized they needed a lot of different solutions for different areas, and this is part of the overall package.
That's good. What about Emily? How did you achieve buy-in on a regional basis, particularly around the cost issues, maintenance, and people wanting to pursue more traditional approaches to mitigation planning?
Yeah, honestly, it goes back to that building your mitigation planning team, which I've been doing hazard mitigation plans for almost a decade, and it is the exception, unfortunately, to have a robust mitigation planning team, and it's really just it's that first step in the process, and whoever you can bring to the table to be a part of that discussion is going to be the I think primary contributing factor into who buys into the plan and the actions that come out of it. So if you've got a planning team of 3, but you've got a municipality of a number of departments and boards and commissions who aren't a part of it, they're not going to have any more buy into that plan than they would any other plan on the shelf. So I think it does matter to have the voices around the table so that the dialogue can happen throughout the process and not once the plan is published.
And just building the story of little projects. And we certainly began with small demonstration projects. We're not that far beyond the small demonstration projects, but the more we can have a success that people can see, they can touch, they can feel, and say, oh, this actually works, the easier it is to go on to the next stage.
And one more thing I'll say, and going back now to the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program that we're working with a lot of communities on, being able to connect what you're doing, what you're planning for, the projects that you're proposing with available funding sources is a great way to get buy-in. You know, the MVP program does focus on nature-based solutions, and that is part of this green infrastructure conversation. And I'm sensing in the last year or two under this MVP program, a lot more highway department folks, DPWs, just a lot of members of these planning teams that are now more open than ever to talking about green solutions, nature-based solutions, because they have this potential $400,000 grant waiting for them after they get through the planning process.
And Emily was talking about sort of the multidisciplinary project team in towns. We also have found some odd partnerships, so that the rain gardens, for example, for us, I said the biggest challenge is maintaining them. We have a group of volunteers who are really focused on improving habitat for pollinators. And as part of that work, they're actually maintaining one of our central rain gardens, the one that's right downtown in a park. And so it's serving pollinator goal, which is not a top goal for the city, even though we're very sympathetic, but it's solving our maintenance issue at the same time.
Excellent. Question, can you, Wayne, explain if or how you did a cost benefit to determine if it makes financial sense to move forward with green infrastructure, given the astonishing difference in maintenance that you highlighted? A pipe has zero maintenance for 160 years versus an annual maintenance of green infrastructure.
So we haven't done a cost-benefit analysis. That's part of what GZA is helping us with, not a formal cost-benefit analysis, but sort of understanding solutions and understanding the costs for doing it. But it comes back for us about the green infrastructure. So on the slide that's up there now, the question slide, the bottom right, so that's a small rain garden. It obviously serves stormwater benefits, but before we began the process, that was just a part of a dirt parking lot right along a main gateway to downtown. So getting rid of that dirt parking lot, making Pleasant Street more attractive entrance to downtown had value for its own sake. And the stormwater benefit was just sort of an extra benefit. The other two pictures are of Pulaski Park downtown. And again, they both have stormwater benefits. We're catching rainwater from Main Street, but we're also making the park a much better place and celebrating water. And so I certainly agree a cost-benefit analysis is really important. You can't just, in terms of benefits, you can't just look at stormwater. You need to look at the overall piece. So we're still in that piloting phase, so we're not yet at that. We haven't yet come to a site with two different solutions, and we say, which one do we want to minimize our costs for long term?
Okay, excellent. And do you have a sense from the planning in Northampton roughly how much of your flood problems are resolvable with green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure?
It's a small percent. I mean, our riverine flooding is by far our biggest challenge. Our downtown is surrounded by a flood control levee, which we live in fear that it fails someday during a storm. And green infrastructure isn't going to solve that. But we also have a lot of localized flooding, both in FEMA floodplains and in local areas that aren't even the floodplain. As Emily mentioned, with changes, we're seeing more sort of small, short storms and less snowfall. So the small flooding things have become more prevalent. So it's a minority, but it's a growing minority. And the green infrastructure is very good for that minority of problems.
Thank you. Another question for you, Wayne. Wayne's observation that permeable paving would be better suited to areas with sandy soils made me smile. DPW guys on Martha's Vineyard shy away from considering permeable paving due to concerns about sand clogging the pores from above. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's two separate things. So the soil that's below the permeable pavement is what we really care about in terms of the permeable pavement continuing to work. So if you're sending water through the pavement and then it's hitting clay soils or it's hitting hazardous waste, which you don't want to migrate, that's not going to be a good site. If the soil below is sand, it could be incredibly successful. There's a separate problem of what's going on top of the permeable pavement that's clogging it. Sand particles, and anything's going to clog it. Clay, silt, or sand are all going to clog it, and sand particles are actually the largest, so they're least likely to clog it. But that's really more of a maintenance issue. And it's a maintenance issue both in terms of vacuuming and regularly maintaining the pavement, but also maintaining the vegetation alongside the pavement so you're not getting soil eroding onto the pavement. And even winter solutions. I mean, we've switched from a salt and sand mixture during the winter to a just salt mixture, and that makes permeable pavement more desirable than we used to be putting a lot of sand out there.
Great, and just to focus on maintenance for a bit more, there's a question about training staff, DPW staff on maintenance as a challenging thing. How have you dealt with that?
I don't work at DPW, so I couldn't tell you enough about what their operations are, but I know that they've really worked hard on sort of trying to understand what's out there, whether it's attending formal workshops or just trading their expertise within the department, but I don't know beyond that what they're doing.
So Rosalie or Emily, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't know specifically what the City of Northampton DPW is doing, but in general, many municipalities throughout Massachusetts and New England are subject to the MS4 permit, which requires in-house training. So I would imagine that could be addressed through those programs.
Okay, I think we're done with the questions. Now on to the resources. Hold on 1 second. Okay, I want to conclude by briefly mentioning the EPA Soak Up the Rain resources that are available on the Soak Up the Rain website that you see. We encourage you to check out the Soak Up the Rain website, which can be found at that URL that's shown on the right. Here's a screenshot of the front page of our website. And to highlight a few sections, there are information on why soak up the rain, how to soak up the rain with all the BMPs, a lot of the BMPs that were mentioned today. There's a lot of outreach tools that can be replicated, and I will show you an example of that. Municipal and community resources. I know one of the resources that was mentioned that you can find on here that Wayne mentioned was the University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center. Great resource that's listed here. We have these customizable outreach materials that you can put your organization's name on it. And that's pretty much concludes it. I want to conclude with thanking again our speakers, our wonderful speakers. Here's their contact information, including mine. And we want to thank everyone who's attended today. Want to thank our speakers, want to thank George Burgos. And that concludes our webinar today.